Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. On this week's episode of Terrible Lizards, we talk Anurognathids, the cutest pterosaur of all time. Plus, you get to hear in the background my cat, Susan. Hello everybody, and we are going from the large to the tiny, and also with a cold, because we're doing Anurognathids. I think that's how you pronounce it, isn't it, Dave?
The Anurognathids, yes.
If you already have a nasal twang, you're going to love this episode, because this episode is for you. They're pterosaurs with a cold.
Possibly, though they have very odd heads, so and with very short noses, so that could at least be contributing to this.
Can we, before we begin, what does the word? Because I don't even know what azhdarchid actually meant. I don't think I asked you in the previous episode. Now I don't know what Anurognathids actually means.
So azhdarchids are named after the original taxon azhdarch, which off the top of my head I can't remember, but I think it was named for someone.
Okay. It sounds a bit like the Ozarks, so it could be a place even.
Yeah, but I think it was Russian or Asian. I'd really want to look that up because I can't remember. But Anurognathids I do know, and so that's Anuro or Anuron as in frogs, and Gnathus as in jaw. So these are the frog jaws because they have almost semicircular Pac-Man heads. They're the opposite of azhdarchids, the great big long beak, and indeed almost all pterosaurs with a relatively long head. These are, at least a couple of them, their heads are wider than they are long. And you contrast that to pterosaurs, and it's extraordinary proportions.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have any of those toys when I was a kid. I only had the long beaky ones. Why were the Anurognathids?
I know of exactly one that was done for the, was it Primeval series on ITV we had here about 10, 15 years ago. And there's an Anurognathed model. It's awful, but it is at least an Anurognathids.
And that's it?
That's the only one I've ever seen.
So why aren't they more sort of widely celebrated? I don't understand.
I don't know. I mean, there was a chat online. Was it Safari, the company? It was kind of like, here, did an open thread on Twitter of like, give us what toys you want us to do. And I'm like, can we do proper pterosaurs? Like, the proper diversity of pterosaurs and actually do the models right? Because I had an opportunity to do that years ago and it fell through, and I would still love to do that. And I would just love to see a company do it. And yeah, Anurognathids are properly weird. I've already spent several episodes rapturing about how weird pterosaurs are. Well, Anurognathids, I would say, are probably the most aberrant and unusual pterosaurs in multiple different ways. And I've done really quite a lot of work on them, and therefore I desperately want to talk about how weird and cool and awesome Anurognathids are.
I think if you look at the paleo art for them, they're amazing, because they're basically bat, fluffy, birdy, not nonsense. They're great.
So they're small. So the smallest at adult size, the biggest Anurognathids are about a metre in wingspan.
That's still massive, though.
Yeah, but that's about as small as any adult pterosaur gets. The 75 centimetres to a metre in wingspan is as small as an adult pterosaur is, and a whole bunch of the Anurognathids are in that size. In fact, we've only got arguably one or two adults, and all the rest are juveniles, right down to some very small animals with, kind of 20, 25 centimetre wingspan.
Like a wren.
Well, no, bigger than a wren. But they are fluffy, so again, we think all pterosaurs probably had body coverings, but the best preserved of those are Anurognathids, particularly a couple of specimens of J. holopterus from China. They've got very short, broad heads with a very short face, so tiny slit of a nose, and then an enormous eyeball that fills like half the head. Giant eyes. We think they're probably nocturnal. Well, we also think we know they can fold their wing finger, which is something that no other pterosaur appears to be capable of doing. So rather than having, joints in the arms and then basically a spar, that joints. Every single Anurognathed that we have has folded joints in the wing finger. They're still flattened off the end to hold them stiff like all other pterosaurs, but they appear capable of flexing them. And the only other things we see that in is one, wings which have disarticulated with the animals, the fossils has come apart, and embryos.
Wow.
Because they have to fit in the egg. So embryonic pterosaurs can flex their wings, but once they're out of the egg, you only ever find them with a single spar wing finger. And Anurognathids, every one of them flexes.
This sounds like an ultimate cartoon character for a kid, because it can. Well, I was going to say for a kid, but
for you,
it could literally, like, be expressive with its wings, like we can with our hands, almost.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that way, strangely enough, but yes, there's that.
It can literally give you a thumbs up with its wings, except it doesn't have a thumb. But you know what I mean.
keep trying. And then to add to some more weird things, we think they're probably hunting insects on the wing. They're like bats, or indeed capromuligiforms. Presumably I said that right, because I hate doing it. So things like whippoorwills, things like nightjars, things like frogmouths. Oddly enough, there's a group of birds called frogmouths who have something similar: short, fat, wide head with big eyes, because they're grabbing insects on the wing, convergent with Anurognathids and indeed some bats. And some of them, they're extremely rare, even by pterosaur standards. We've dug up a fair few more in recent years, but we're still at something like 14 specimens. And a handful of them, 3 or 4 of them, are among the best preserved pterosaurs. So again, there's 2 specimens in particular of a thing called J-Alopterus from China, which, have better preservation, in particular of the wings, the membranes, and the fluff of basically any pterosaur. So they're this weird group. We don't really know where they sit evolutionarily within the pterosaur tree. They've been found just about everywhere, which is half the problem of working out what the hell they're doing. Actually, we talk about that. So they are non-pterodactyloid pterosaurs. So they are outside of the...
So they're not related to pterodon or, any of the others?
Well, so...
Pteranodon.
Here we go. Well,
we don't know if they are.
So they have a bunch of features which clearly plant them outside of the classic pterodactyloid. So they don't have a great big long head. They don't have a long neck. They do have a short wing metacarpal. They do have a long 5th toe. But already they start going wrong. They have a short tail. For a non-pterodactyloid pterosaur, which the defining feature of which is they have a long tail, Anurognathids have tiny tails. Really, really short. Shorter than any other non-pterodactyloid.
Most bats have a very short tail.
Yeah, though a few are relatively long-tailed. Even that tail is only the length of the hind limbs. It doesn't stick out to any great extent. Actually, a paper that I did recently where we had yet another Anurognathed revision of their phylogeny and taxonomy, we found actually we got 2 clusters, and we got an older cluster of longer tails and a later cluster of shorter tails. Suggests that the tail does shorten over time. I'd already published a paper back in 2010 pointing out that actually the, inverted commas, short-tailed, long-tailed split, in general, it holds up quite well, but Pteranodon has an unusually long tail. Things like Pterodostro, I think we mentioned, the filter-feeding a flamingo-like one from Argentina for a pterodactyloid, has a really long tail.
And then, long teeth.
And lots of long teeth. Still short in the grand scheme of things. It's less than the length of the hind legs, but much, much longer than almost any of its relatives. So this long-tailed, short-tailed split, whilst generally holding true, masks a whole bunch of diversity, both within the longer and shorter-tailed ones. There are short-tailed ones which have tails twice as long as other short-tailed ones, and long-tailed ones that have tails half the length of other long-tailed ones. We need to stop making this binary split into long and short and start looking at the variation. So Anurognathids have a couple of features like that. Another one which is massively debated, which comes from them having this super short head, which is then... But their head is basically made up of little splinters of bone. And guess what happens when you flatten that? Yeah. And so one of these things is, I'm sure we talked about this, the naso-antorbital fenestra. So in a normal...
Ooh, that sounds like the nasal, so that's nose, antorbital, that's ants in your eyes, and fenestra is a type of window.
Yes. Near enough. So yeah, so in archosaurs, so that includes crocodiles and pterosaurs and dinosaurs and indeed birds, though it's modified in a whole bunch of them, you have your naris, hole at the front for the nose, the orbit, the hole for the eye, and then you have the ant anterior in front of orbit, the orbit, fenestra, window, opening. You have a hole in front of the eye, and that's the antorbital fenestra. And as you might imagine from the kind of Germanification and the way that scientists do this. So a naso-antorbital fenestra is simply the nares, the nasal, the nares, the nostril, and the antorbital fenestra being shunted together. In other words, we've got rid of the spar of bone that would separate them and turns it into one giant hole in the front of the head. That's a feature of pterodactyloids. It is also, now we see, a feature of Darwinopterus and its relatives. So remember, they sit in that weird group, like in between, where they've got basically the head of a neck of a pterodactyloid and the body of a non-pterodactyloid, and they kind of sit weirdly in the group. And then we've got the Anurognathids, which some people have said have a naso-antorbital fenestra, and other people have said, no, the skull is just smushed and all the shards have gone everywhere, and you can't really tell, but there's probably a separation between those two. I sit firmly on that side of the fence. I'm going to do the ultimate annoying thing, which always annoys people and has annoyed me repeatedly. I have seen an unpublished specimen which definitively shows a massive thick bar of bone between the nares and the antorbital fenestra for an Anurognathed. At least some of them definitely had that. But this weird short head with this question mark naso-antorbital fenestra and then the reduced tail has led to a couple of recoveries where Anurognathids have come out either as very close to pterodactyloids or in one case even between those Darwinopterus-like animals and the pterodactyloids. So it even though the head of like Darwinopterus basically is the head of Pterodactylus, like frighteningly similar, and then they drop in the middle. But other people have found them in the middle of the non-pterodactyloids, somewhere branching in an odd bit of the non-pterodactyloids, and as the earliest non-pterodactyloids. So depending on who you believe, they're the earliest branch of pterosaur evolution, somewhere in the middle in 2 or 3 different places of early pterosaur evolution, or right up alongside the origin of pterodactyloids. So we've really narrowed it down to just about anywhere depending on who you believe, which is a nightmare when you want to understand their evolution and the evolution of the animals around them. But I think people think that like all of this is just irrelevant. You know, it's like, well, we kind of want to know the answer, but does it really matter? And the answer actually is kind of yeah, because all the earliest pterosaurs that we've got are ocean-going or at least marine coastal animals. And Anurognathids almost certainly lived like deep in forests. So if they're the earliest pterosaurs, that tells us that pterosaurs probably evolved in trees, in forests, in land. And if they're not, they almost certainly evolved in coasts and cliffs and flying out overseas. And the difference between those two is enormous and then would colour the entire trajectory of pterosaur evolution. So it's not just well, we'd really like to know because we kind of like to know these things. This is where and how did pterosaurs evolve is in the Anurognathids, in my opinion, and we don't know.
So do we actually have, because I know we don't have many actual examples of Anurognathids, but do we have any from the late Jurassic? Are they that early or? So
that's exactly that. You're thinking late Triassic, and that is exactly the problem. Where we've got them from is Middle Jurassic, late Jurassic, and then, interestingly, early Cretaceous. They're the only non-pterodactyloids to get over the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary and survive into the Cretaceous. And that was actually fairly contentious because, inevitably, most of these things came from that bit of China that we've talked about many times before, where we all thought there was one big formation and it was all early Cretaceous, and then we realised that it wasn't, and it's actually spread out over a much bigger period of time. So J-Holopterus, for example, is now not from what we would classically call the J-hole fauna. It's actually an older thing. So despite its name, it's probably Middle Jurassic in origin, end of the Middle Jurassic, earliest late Jurassic, and not early Cretaceous. But there are some other bits, including a famously inaccessible specimen from North Korea, which is almost certainly early Cretaceous because it was found in close association with some pretty derived birds, which implies it's truly Cretaceous beds. There is one paper with exactly one photo, and it's a bad photo of a bad specimen that has been scanned badly from the original print of this Cretaceous North Korean Anurognathed, and the damn skeleton's complete. And if you look at it and measure its proportions and ratios and things, it's quite probably a new species. And yeah, curiously enough,
North Korea.
No, yeah, one guy, so a Chinese scientist called Gao Kachin got invited to go over there and look at a couple of this stuff and somehow got permission to publish these photos. So there's one photo of the Anurognathids and one photo of one of the birds. And that's what we've got, but we know it's out there. But yeah, they're surprisingly sparse. There's like a fragment of a humerus, I think, from North America, which is allegedly an Anurognathids, and there's basically no way of knowing. There's a couple of fragments from, I want to say, Eastern Russia or Mongolia, I can't remember which, but they're fragments, and people have gone, oh, we think these are Anurognathids, and I think that's we don't know what it is, and it's a pterosaur, so we're going to guess Anurognathids. The stuff we've definitely got, we've got a couple of specimens from, yet again, the Solnhofen, so late Jurassic Germany. We've got several specimens from Kazakhstan, and then everything else is Chinese, plus that North Korean one. So, again, these beds of exceptional preservation, when you find them, you find them. And it's notable that, with the exception of Anurognathids itself, the original one from Germany, they're all very inland animals. So we're finding these in lake and river deposits in environments that we know were fully inland and lots of trees and things. And yet we think they're little forest flying around insect hunters.
Batty.
Yeah, we think they're hiding out on trees. They're actually the only pterosaur that's had some work done on its colour and found that they were kind of browny. It's exactly what we'd expect. They're the only group without any evidence of head crests, soft or hard tissue in any way, shape or form. We think the wing folding links to that. If you can imagine, they're hiding in tree hollows or on tree branches, being able to fold themselves up small and compact and get into spaces that others can't. And again, they're pretty small. This all kind of fits together. So it explains why we're often not finding them in environments where we actually find a lot of other pterosaurs, which are generally marine sediments, plus they're tiny. It also probably explains why their evolutionary history is so rubbish. Well, their fossil history is so rubbish. They're small and living in tree hollows. This is not where you get good fossils from, unfortunately. When we do find them, in the grand scheme of things, they're in relatively high numbers. So, like several other things, when conditions are right for us to find them, we find them. And there's lots of them and quite a few different species. And actually, even the German ones, if you look at that, we've talked about Pterodactylus already. We've talked about Rhamphorhynchus in a previous series. Huge numbers of specimens and lots of their relatives all floating around in massive numbers in the Solnhofen. 2 Anurognathids in, 250 years. Why? Because they're probably not flying out over the lagoon very often. In the same way that actually we've only got, a dozen Archaeopteryx and 3 or 4 dinosaurs. The land-living animals aren't getting into the water very often. And so that's probably why we're just not finding them. So,
I just like the idea that, in my head, you see, what I've done is I've divided the pterosaurs now into the pterosaur Wookiees and the pterosaur Ewoks. We are definitely in Ewok territory.
Yes, they are small and floofy, but even there, so we've learned a lot. As I said, the exceptional preservation. We have learned a lot about pterosaur wings and body coverings just from Anurognathids. So as a paper I was an author on in 2010, 2012. On Jailopterus, so this beautiful big Anurognathids from China. It's that classic Chinese preservation where it looks absolutely magnificent and it's so complete with all this soft tissue. And the more and more you look at it, and when you stick under a microscope, the less and less you can see. It's like I always liken it to when I've taken a photo on my camera. Now everyone's digital, and you take that photo, you go, "That's a really nice photo," and then you zoom in to check a detail, and you realise it's ever so slightly out of focus, and what looks okay at a distance looks worse and worse and worse the more you zoom in on it, and you suddenly can't see anything anymore. You think, oh well, hey, is that Brian in the background? I'll zoom in a bit, and then the face just gets pixely and blurry, and it's like, I can't even see which is hair and which is face now, and you zoom back out again. That's what it looks like.
That is Brian.
Yeah,
to be fair.
That's what it looks like, and even better, when the slabs split, the bone split in half. So we've actually got a plate and counterplate, is what we call it, both of which have bones on. Normally when you get plate counterplate, people see this with ammonites a lot. It separates, and the ammonite is perfect in one side, and then the other half has an imprint of the ammonite. No, the fossil has shattered down the middle and opened up, and so now you're looking at the inside of the bones on both sides. So they're a mirror image. We actually did a really nice fix for a paper I did 5 or 6 years ago, where my former PhD student, Ross Elgin, very kindly did a stitch together. Ross was good with digital photos, and I'm extremely proud of this photo and getting it into the paper we did in JVP, Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, where Ross got a really good photo of both sides, digitally flipped one, put it over the top of the original, and then did an awful lot of jigging and stretching and skewing, because of course, however good you take those photos, they are never going to be perfectly square on to the original, and basically got everything to line up. And what it means is when you normally look at them and you go, oh, there's a hole on this side and a fill on the other side and vice versa, those are now stitched all back together. So it is a much, much more complete image of the fossil than you could ever get from looking at the two separate pieces, which is really, really nice. But yeah, it looks fantastic. And then the more you look at it, the worse it is. And the skull is just smushed. So it's just us, because you've got the top of the skull and it's just bone bits. And you go, oh, I can see it's really quite wide and it's not very long and it's got quite a big head, and yeah, I'm running out of bones after that. Like, you can't.
I'm surprised with the double image that you can't sort of like look at it up close and move back like one of those magic eye drawings. That might help. Have you tried doing that?
We haven't. No.
Oh, I see. But yeah, I mean, so it's got its head, we presume, because it's got these light bones. So they're still incredibly light animals.
Oh yeah. I mean, we don't know much about their pneumaticity. I am guessing it's not that high. Simply because it doesn't really need to. So remember that, mass scales much faster as you get bigger because of the cube law, and they're simply not very big. So they will be pneumatic, but I suspect they're nothing like as pneumatic as you might expect for animals popping out mostly in the late Cretaceous, late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. But I don't think we've ever really looked. And again, it's one of those things where they're so rare, no one really wants to smash them up and take a look, unfortunately. One thing, actually, I'll comment on. I will get back to talking about Geolopterus in a minute, but it's a relevant thing to that problem of working out where they fit, is, I think, largely a result, actually, of their head and body shape. They're all preserved top down or bottom up. In other words, they look like you've properly just run them over. So you're looking at either the top of the head or the underside of the head. And if you look at basically almost any other pterosaur fossil ever, the head is turned on its side. You're looking at the side because it's a long, thin, flat thing that will tend to flap over as sediment tips on it, and it will rotate it. And that won't with a head that's about as broad as it is long and is roughly in line with the body. And so we've got this other weird anomaly whereby, when we're trying to do our analyses and we want to look at all these details of skulls and things, every other pterosaur is on its side, and then all the Anurognathids are top down or bottom up. So you're not even looking at the same bones.
No.
You just can't even see them, let alone seeing them in the same orientation. And the one exception, ironically, is the original Anurognathids fossil that comes from the Solnhofen, which does have its head preserved side on. And it's shattered and mostly missing, and it's kind of a terrible impression in a rock that I suspect was prepared bad, because this was in like the late 1800s. So the only one that we've actually got in the view that would allow us to compare it to the others is like smack beyond recognition. And actually the early reconstructions of it had it with a much longer head, because of course everything else had a long head. And there's a couple of weirdly anomalous other pterosaurs, I think ornithochirids, so very pteranodon-like long heads but just with teeth in, were reconstructed like Anurognathids at one point, because they just had jaw tips and they just went, make a little head with fangs at the front. So you have these weirdly squashed heads. Yeah. So going back to Geolopterus and wings and filaments. So yeah, they have whole body covering from the front of the head to the back, even a little tuft on the end of the tail, which is quite neat. All over the body. Very, it looks like a lot of these birds do, in that it's kind of, frankly, it looks like my hair. Not that shows up online, but enough people have seen videos of me by now.
Dave has the thickest hair of any human male I've ever seen. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And yes, it grows basically up.
Yeah, but it all kind of fluffs out, and again, people, as they have done with a lot of early birds, and then things like troodontids and dromaeosaurs, they draw them with like this kind of wet dog look. And that's almost certainly not the case. That's because they've been sat in water and everything's gone everywhere. So they are very furry, but I don't think they're shaggy. I think they're smooth. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say, it is argued in several papers that some of these filaments branch, so they're not just like individual hairs, you're getting branching. That is something that we see in a bunch of early feathers. So this is another reason that people are saying that pycnofibers, as we call them in pterosaurs, might truly be feathers, share a single origin. I'm still on the fence about that. I think more and more people are thinking that's true, but it doesn't really matter. I'm giving you both sides. That's my opinion. But whatever it is, some of them appear to branch. That's interesting in itself. They don't go out onto the wing. They go out into kind of like the base of the wing, that little crux bit kind of in the elbow alongside the body. They start to extend. And after that, there's a couple of odd little ones, but they don't fundamentally have furry wings. One possible exception to that actually is the tip of the wing of J. halopterus, which has a few little filaments sticking off the back of the end of it.
So is that like hair on your knuckles?
Almost, but it was the tip of the wing membrane.
Okay.
But that has been argued purely by analogy. It's not like anyone's tried to do any work on this, but it's certainly a possibility. Barn owls, and well, owls in general, have structure like that on some of the tips of their feathers, and it's basically a silencing adaptation to reduce the noise of the wind going over the wings. And it's been argued that J. halopterus and indeed other Anurognathids have this like wing silencing baffle on the tips of the wings. It's just a few filaments sticking out on the tip, but we don't see them on other pterosaurs which have got filaments. We don't see other ones with very well preserved wings. This is something which is supposed to be a nocturnal hunter of small animals. It is at least plausible that that is why it has this, and that's what it's doing.
And how do you know that they're nocturnal? Is it just the eye socket size?
But basically, yeah, they have massive, massive eyes. They're absolutely enormous. They really fill the sky. It is hard to emphasize just how ludicrously oversized their eyes are. You know, you will find much larger pterosaurs with smaller eyes. And remember, it's absolute eye size, not proportional eye size, which is a key component of this. One thing we wrote about in our paper that came out, just a few months ago now, is we pointed out that actually their head shape grows very, very strangely. So we've talked about how Rhamphorhynchus is near enough isometric, like everything just grows in the same proportion, and then the eyeball shrinks a bit, which is kind of what you expect as animals kind of grow into their eyes.
Relative to the skull size, not the actual eyeball shrinks.
Yeah. But with Anurognathids, that's even more extreme. The eyeball is absolutely colossal in juveniles, and it stays very big in the adults. But what happens is the head actually proportionally shrinks. So if you look at something like Anurognathids, it's got a head that's like the same size as its body. So we've got two Anurognathids specimens. One's a very young juvenile, and one's probably about mid-size. But the head's colossal. And then if you look at J. halopterus, actually, and we've actually, for J. halopterus, got two. We've got a mid-sized juvenile and then a true adult. And the true adult has a fairly small head. It's about the size that you'd predict for an animal of that size that's a non-pterodactyloid. And then in the juvenile one, the head's proportionally much bigger. And it looks like actually the body is growing to catch up the head and eyes as it grows. And our interpretation of this is that actually they're feeding on fairly similar size insects at all sizes. And so the eye size to function at night and the gape size to capture insects doesn't really change whether or not you're a baby Anurognathed or an adult Anurognathed. So when you're a baby, you grow this giant head and then you just keep it your whole life and the rest of the body grows to catch up until you end up with a small head.
It makes me think of tadpoles. So you've got tadpoles have like they almost look like a giant head, and then they start to, and then there's this weird moment where they're tiny little frogs and then the body catches up.
Yeah, and by that size, the head of a froglet is about the same size as it was as a tadpole. Yeah, that's what we think is going on with them, which is cool and weird in itself.
So if they're, juveniles and they need the same sort of size head and eyes as adults, does that imply that they're not getting parental care?
Well, not necessarily, of course, because it depends quite what they're doing. So remember, juveniles are naive and don't necessarily know what and how to hunt and where to go and what's good and what's bad and what to avoid. Also, remember that even if they say have similar sized heads and similar sized eyes, implying they're hunting the same size of prey at the same time of day, things like weight and what we call wing loading is going to change dramatically. So the adults are going to fly rather differently to the juveniles. And you can imagine that they might have the head is still growing a little bit. They might have some more jaw power and things like this, or just intelligence, experience. So they're capable of catching things things that babies aren't. Because remember, there's really quite a lot of insects that are similar sizes. And for example, I could, just conceive that, you'd have a beetle and a moth flying around. Well, the beetle's a lot harder to process, and it's going to be heavy and strong and fat, and it's got armour all over it, and the moth isn't. But actually, in terms of size and getting it down you, they're about the same. So they're not necessarily competing. And yeah, there is at least the option for adults to be catching stuff for the babies. But as I think we talked about before, I'm simply based on the fact that they're archosaurs, I would expect there to be pre and post hatching parental care in pterosaurs, but we really don't know very much about it.
Okay, I just love I've got this image of this basically plushy toy with these amazing wings. So could they hold a mug of tea? That is what I want to. Well, could I sit down for a cup of tea?
They still got the little 3 clawed fingers at the front.
I know, but they can't do that like a normal. If a pterosaur.
Could they wrap it around?
Exactly.
Yes, because they've got this finger flexion. But remember, it points in the opposite direction of the other fingers.
Okay. Oh, that's weird though. That's a bit freaky. Yeah. So they could hold they could double hold. They could hold their biscuit away from their tea with the same hand.
If they curled it around the edge, yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Sorry, I'm just trying to make friends with Anurognathids, and
We were talking about filaments, and we got very, very distracted.
We were talking about filaments. Because can I? Because I remember, and literally, I'm getting this from stuff I learned in primary school. So we got given feathers and told to look at them.
Oh, the way they zip together.
Exactly the way they zip and everything else. So when I think of a filament, I am literally thinking of almost a hair-like centre with other tiny, tiny little hairs floofing off it, like a tiny mini feather almost. So now, I think that's probably not correct.
So what you probably want to think of is, and if you need to know your feathers or start plucking birds to get at this.
I will. I'll see if any will be compliant.
So mostly what we're talking about when we talk about early filaments in pterosaurs and many, many dinosaurs, tyrannosaurs, compsognathids, ornithomimosaurs, and things like this. We are talking about single filaments. They are more or less just a hair in the way that we would pluck a hair out from our own head or from a dog or something like that.
From a dog.
And again, if you're looking at birds, chicks, a baby chick, whether it's a hideously ugly pigeon or an extremely cute chicken, they're basically just fluff ball. That's it. We don't have any kind of shaft to the feather, which is what a traditional mental picture of a feather is, with stuff coming off it and stuff coming off that and stuff coming off that to hold it all together. When we're talking about branching filaments at this point, and again, similarly with some of the other non-flying derived theropod dinosaurs, we're talking effectively of a cluster of them coming off a single point, but still not necessarily any shaft. So when you've got a dog, or I used to get this on my rabbit, and they're molting, and you pull it out, and sometimes you almost get like a little tuft because there's a grain of dust or something at the bottom, and then
or a scab or something.
Yeah, or something more like that. That's a bit too much because there's usually 30 or 40 or 50 hairs there, but imagine like half a dozen like that, just one of those little darts that kind of comes out. That's what we're now talking about. There's still no branch or big thing cobbling it together. We're talking about the tiniest of bases perhaps, and then they've just split. Talk about split ends. Imagine a split end just like 20 times or 10 times over. That's what we're talking about.
So same point and just like sploofing out.
Almost like a feather duster, but where each feather in the feather duster is just a strand rather than a complete
like a
feather.
pom-pom, but only like a couple of pom-pom bits.
A couple of bits, yeah.
Yeah.
We've described that 6 ways now.
You've got me
hopefully we've
mug
got it
holding plus biscuit holding flying pom-pom frog faces is what now is in my head.
This might be a long title for the eventual podcast, but yes.
The Ewoks of the pterosaur kingdom.
Yeah.
So what else can we say about them? So we know they're hunting insects. We know that they're...
Well, we think they are. I mean, the other thing to say, so that head shape. So again, it does line up with some bats. It really lines up with a lot of insect-eating birds, particularly nocturnal birds.
And frogs.
And indeed, frogs and toads and a bunch of, other amphibians as well. So, as I said, skull is super, super thin, built up of all these little struts. The jaw is basically a semicircle. Remember, remember, it's a reptile, so it's a very simple lever that just opens it. To say Pac-Man, we're not kidding. Bunch of teeth. So not many teeth, actually. Sorry, bunch implies quite a lot. Not many teeth. So quite widely spaced, and they're mostly very short, simple spikes or slightly curved things. No big fangs, no big long teeth.
Molars for crunching.
Yeah, no big rows of them or anything like that. Even the ones they do have, they're pretty short and simple. There was one paper that suggested that one thing which originally was called Dendrorhynchoides mutadongensis, and I renamed it as Luopterus after my friend Liu Jin Chang after he passed away. I think we mentioned that before. But in the original paper, because I wrote that with Liu, he and I really argued over this question mark tooth. And I was very sure that it was just a splint of bone, and he was sure it was a little crunching tooth. And in the end, I thought we'd agreed that it was just a bit of bone, or at least we weren't sure. And I discovered that when the paper came out, he'd edited it at the last minute to say that it was a crunching tooth. I'm very sure it isn't, and I've subsequently said, I really don't think it is. I don't think they have complicated teeth going on.
It's not what
here.
You wrote, Dave. Scientifically, we can say that Dave Hone thinks that it was a crunching tooth, but in actuality, we can say
this is why you can write papers later. In my subsequent paper where I named this animal after him, I also said he got the tooth wrong.
Okay.
Changed it. But yeah, surprisingly simple teeth. But again, that's sort of what you might expect if they are, I did mention beetles, but if they're mostly eating things like moths and crane flies and stuff like this, which we know are out there in large numbers, we find them in these deposits, then yeah, they're pretty fragile insects that don't require a lot of biting and crunching and mashing up. You just kind of need to get them in your mouth and then get them down. And that appears to be pretty much what they were doing. But
they do require the large mouth. Is that simply either to fit? Is it because they need to fit the insect in their mouths, or is it because that gives them a better, chance of actually catching them?
The gape. I think it's the trying to catch them phenomenon. Okay. Again, they're flying around and trying to grab something in the air. Even if you look at things like swifts and swallows, which of course still have a little pointy beak at the front, they've got quite a wide gape and a very broad head. And particularly if you look at things like frog-mouthed birds, they're called frog-mouths, and whippoorwills are in another group. They really have this very, very wide gape, and it's, and it also gives you a very fast jaw action because it's not long. You can actually snap it shut relatively quickly. There's a kind of weird phenomenon. If you have a long, thin jaw, you can actually get rapid biting on it because you're getting some leverage over that length, and you get that kind of slightly chopstick effect. The alternative is to make it super short so it doesn't have to travel that far. They've probably got a pretty fast snapping but not hard snapping jaw to just grab something. Is that a weird cat?
That's Susan.
It sounds distorted and like some kind of electronic number.
That's the noise. That's the what are you doing, Izzy? I feel lonely.
I need to distract you. Yeah.
Talking of a wide gaping maw.
And then hunting on the wing. Their overall wing proportions are pretty much what you'd expect for flying in what we call a cluttered environment. They're relatively short and deep. That's what you expect. You don't want super long wings when you're trying to fly between branches and twigs and hit things. It makes them really pretty maneuverable. Their wing shape is comparable to that of some bats. It's actually pretty comparable to that of things like nightjars and whippoorwills again. So again, add that to the giant eyes as a reason to think. We often talk about them hunting in low light conditions. And that's
crepuscular.
Well, but also just general forest darkness. If you think about dense, if you've walked through a dense forest, it's pretty dark when you get near the bottom. Yeah, the shafts of light can open it up, but it can be quite low light. I don't think they're exactly diurnal, but yeah, whether they're crepuscular or nocturnal and whether they're happy to fly around in the darker bits of the forest under the right circumstances, it's hard to say. I'm increasingly veering towards truly nocturnal, personally. I think a few people are. And that, again, another reason that pterosaurs or Anurognathids as pterosaurs are weird. there's nocturnality has been suggested for a couple of others, but for some very flimsy reasoning, and I think is almost certainly wrong. But these ones really seem to have gone for it. And again, that might explain why, although we've got this big gap in their early fossil record, almost certainly they got into the Cretaceous because they're doing stuff that no other pterosaur can do. And at the time, none of the birds were doing. They're flying at night and they're good flyers and grabbing stuff that's in the air.
See, I went because I kind of want them to be flapping around in the daytime hunting, because that implies, therefore, that with these big eyes, if there are beams of light going through, they're going to need like really sort of like blinky, lovely eyelids to really shut. And then I've got the image of them sort of like squinting as they're flying, which I really, because then you could put little glasses on their noses and they look like grannies. And then with their cup of tea and their biscuit, it's going to be amazing.
It's funny how these podcasts go.
It's what I take away from all of your hard work and analysing all of these fossils and interpolating and looking at other species and saying, well, this data could suggest this and that. I'm imagining old granny Ewoks flapping through the trees, squinting through their little reading glasses, trying to find a moth. We should talk about what they're hunting a little bit, because, you know, we do have evidence of insects in the same beds that have been really nicely preserved. So, and they are very similar to modern day insects.
Oh, yeah. I mean, almost everything that you think of as a major group that's around now was around then. So we've got beetles and grasshoppers and crane flies and moths and flies and fleas and spiders. I know they're not insects, but, you know, these, again, small edible things, small edible terrestrial invertebrates that might be eaten by all of that stuff is around in large numbers. And even slightly more obscure ones like scorpion flies and stuff like this we find, and exceptionally well preserved and in very large numbers in things like the J-hole or the Tioji Shan, the older Middle Jurassic one.
Is it true that they were larger?
No, so that goes back to the fact that when you get right back into the Permian, and actually particularly into like the Carboniferous, yes, there were really big, the famous 50 centimeter wingspan dragonflies and stuff like that was around then. Once you're in the dinosaur era, we don't have that super high oxygen level that's going to support these much larger animals, because they've just got a diffusion problem. They need to get oxygen into themselves, and that's basically difficult for them at what we consider now normal oxygen concentrations.
They did that on an episode of Doctor Who. They got a spider that kept growing, and eventually, the spider would have died before it reached the size it was.
I'm sure it would.
Yes, but the idea was it got so large because insects breathe through little spiracles, is that right? And so you have to get the air to the muscle.
So they do different things, but yeah, a lot of insects have holes called spiracles down the side of the body, and those are little they open up to like a little branching tube and then help air diffuse. If you watch a big insect like a locust on a hot day, you'll see it like pulsing its abdomen and trying to and literally just pumping and trying to get air moving. Things like spiders and scorpions have what are called book lungs. So on the underside of the body, they have these cavities, and they have loads and loads of little thin plates. So like if you hold a book upside down and open, it's all the leaves hang down. That's kind of what they look like to a massive surface area increase, and they can do a little bit of pumping as well. But still, you fundamentally got a problem that you're largely relying on the air diffusing deep into the body. And so if there's only so much oxygen around, you're going to be limited on how big your body can be before you stop functioning.
I think bees as well. Isn't the noise of a bee buzzing its spiracles and not its wings?
That's news to me, but I can imagine it's, or at least a combination of the air moving across it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I might be wrong. That might be Izzy science.
That's a new one on me. But yeah, there are loads and loads and loads of insects. And and dragonflies are another big one. There's loads of them around. And actually we get quite a lot of dragonflies in the Solnhofen because they are happier going out over water. And at least a few with chunks taken out of their wings, which has been pointed out by Dave Unwin years ago. That is, you tend to find very well preserved insects in the Triassic and the early Jurassic. And once pterosaurs get going and we have more terrestrial pterosaurs, you start finding them with damaged wings, which he implies is pterosaurs taking chunks out of them. Whether that actual trend is true, it would be really nice if it was the case. And it's one I'd definitely categorise as. It could be. It's the sort of thing you'd really need to look at, like rates of damage and environment and turnover and what they're buried in and where they lived, and it's probably too complicated to suss out and it won't really tell you anything.
I think your data set's not going to be big enough.
Well, I think it probably is, because in the right places, of course, they're in vast numbers, because insects and invertebrates are so numerous. Yeah, I mean, there are, I've been to a couple of collections in China. So there was one, what was it? What's its correct now? I think it's the Geological Museum of China. Admittedly, they had an expert there on J-hole insects, but they had drawers and drawers and drawers and drawers and drawers and drawers. For all that we go, like, look how many feathered dinosaurs there are. That has nothing on things like the lacewings and the butterflies and the spiders. Just vast numbers of them. So yeah, there's certainly lots of food about, and that's, really going to potentially drive this. It's one of those things where it's kind of weird that other pterosaurs didn't go into this niche. A whole bunch of different birds have all gone down there's loads of flying insects to eat, we should eat them, and yet one lineage of pterosaurs ever seem to have gone down the route of we should specialise in catching insects while we're flying around. That's weird.
Yeah, I mean, you got the ones that go for the sort of, you can't really call shrimp and stuff insects, but the one that's like a flamingo.
Yeah, but not in the air. I mean, not stuff that's either flying or at least landing on branches or can be grabbed.
There's no evidence that Quetzalcoatlus actually had like a massive membrane that it could just open up and be like a whale of the sky.
I think I mentioned this in the Azhdarchid episode. Someone suggested that they were pelican-like and that the lower jaw distended with a giant pouch to catch fish, which it wouldn't, because it's completely the wrong type of bone and it's not remotely shaped like a pelican beak. But people have suggested that for pterosaurs, though azhdarchids, though it's a classic example of it's got a big head and I think it ate fish, therefore it's a pelican level of logic, which is frankly appalling. Because the one thing pelican beaks have is, because they do that and they really do bow massively, they only meet right at the very tip, so that they've got that maximum length to flex along. Whereas azhdarchid beaks are fused solid for the front third. I mean, they're obviously completely different. There's just no comparison at all. So why is that your comparison?
Because it's fun.
Yeah. Waste of ink and paper is what it was. But anyway.
So back to the mug holders.
Back to Anurognathids. We got distracted. I twice tried to get back to filaments, then we ended up going down lots of other.
Back to filaments.
So filaments over the body, only getting into the start of the wings, plus or minus these little fuzzy tips. They really have some exceptionally well-preserved wings, certainly this one specimen of Jalopterus, showing you that the wings are deep and broad, and that they have these actinofibrils, which in case we know about for lots of others, but again, they're extremely well-preserved. There's an argument that a couple of the actinofibrils split and had some branching in this one specimen of Jalopterus.
So the actinofibrils are the muscles that mean that you can contract the wings?
No, they're the reinforcing things.
Thingies, yes.
Because we don't know what they're made of. It's been suggested they're keratin. It's been suggested they're cartilage. It's been suggested they're like weird pseudo-tendons.
Pipe cleaners?
Probably not.
Okay.
But they're, dozens and dozens and dozens of these very fine little strands. I mean, the best thing to describe them is we think they're functioning like dry spaghetti. So fundamentally, they're actually pretty stiff, but they get a fair bit of flexion on them across a long piece.
I think celery sticks.
Okay.
I think those little things down the celery, those celery stringy things.
Oh, right, the stringy bits, yeah. And so you can imagine if you pack loads of them together, you've actually got a lot of stiffness, but again with some flexion, and if they're further and further apart, you're going to have less stiffening and more flexion. And that's what you have. Very stiff outboard and getting fewer and further between inboard and changing their angle as well a bit, which is interesting. But Jalopterus has led to the suggestion that a couple of these are split. Now, I'm on the paper that says that, and I looked at them under the microscope, and I can't see it. They're so hard to interpret. I can buy that it could be, but if I'd written that, I'd have used the word may or possibly or might split, because I can't see it with anything like the confidence to say that I'm happy that that's genuinely what they're doing. They're just not preserved well enough. Annoyingly, because it's such an otherwise beautifully preserved specimen. The bigger adult specimen shows a really nice uropatagium, so the leg membrane, which is really nice. The younger specimen that I mentioned, which is rather more fragmentary and actually a bit broken up, but it shows a very nice broad propatagium, so the front one in the kind of crux at the elbow. And neither of them, as again we already knew from some other specimens, but really nice confirmation that neither of those have fibres in them. Probably muscle fibres, but not the actinofibrils. So that's probably explains why those are much, much rarer in terms of preservation. They're probably thinner and they lack some stiffening, so they just tend to fall apart and decay a lot quicker.
And you know, they've got all of these, they're all tied together. We talked about this in the pterosaurs in motion episode. So are they ones a bit like umbrellas blown down the street?
But this is the interesting thing. If you remember, I said that I think that in general for the non-pterodactyloids, which remember have long, relatively stiffened tails, the uropatagium in the legs goes from fifth toe to fifth toe via the tail and physically attaches to it. Well, in Jailopterus, it's got the tail is shorter than the breadth of the preserved uropatagium. So if that's the case, either the tail's like embedded in it and then stops short of the end of the uropatagium, which seems unlikely, or the uropatagium's rather smaller in this than any of the others, which seems unlikely, and we've misinterpreted it, or that they're fundamentally separate when they're not in the other groups, which would be unusual and not very likely because pterosaurs tend to be very consistent like that. So what the hell is it doing? Any of the possibilities are unusual and weird, and so it doesn't really matter which of those models you favour for whatever reasons you may favour. It appears to be quite distinct to other non-pterodactyloids, and again that feeds back into the idea that it might actually be close to the pterodactyloids in some ways. I really don't think that's the case of the record. I'm very sure that they are not particularly close to the pterodactyloids or even Darwinopterus and kin, the inverted commas non-monofenestratans. Sorry, not in inverted commas because that implies they're not a true clade. The early non-monofenestratans, remove inverted commas from your mental image of that word. I'm still fairly happy with the idea that Anurognathids could basically be late surviving very early pterosaurs, and we're just not finding them in the Triassic. Or a couple of analyses have come out more recently, and at least another one I know is on the way, suggesting they're kind of buried in the middle of the early non-pterodactyloid pterosaurs. I still remain to be convinced, but some people who really know what they're doing with that are increasingly convincing me. But either way, they're going to end up with what we call a ghost lineage, the period of time where we think they must be present, but we haven't found them. And actually, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. So even this idea that they are like the earliest pterosaurs, they truly represent the earliest branch of pterosaurs, but the earliest we find them in is the end of the Middle Jurassic. That still makes a lot of sense because it plugs into that idea that actually we've talked about before with the origin of pterosaurs themselves. Anurognathids are small by pterosaur standards. They appear to be relatively uncommon in the grand scheme of things, even though they're very common in exactly the right spots. And they're living not just around, but even potentially in trees, like physically in tree hollows and stuff like this. If you want an animal that's not going to be preserved and found in the fossil record, you want something that's small and hides in trees and is not very common and isn't necessarily, and as a result, if it's living in trees, isn't living near water. It's everything you'd want from an animal to not show up in the fossil record for 100 million years, and therefore could easily explain why we don't find them for the first 70, 80 million years of pterosaur evolution.
Other than the fossil record of where we don't find them and the shape of their wing, is there any other evidence that they're living in the trees themselves? Have they got the claws? Are they good at climbing?
So they've got big claws on the hands, so that's true of nearly all pterosaurs and is true of non-pterodactyloids in particular. They've got relatively big claws on the feet, which is unusual for pterosaurs in general and points to the feet being more engaged. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, that wing folding, the idea that actually to fit themselves into little holes and hollows, the folding of the wing finger would be relevant for that. And then we have the idea that two different Anurognathids, so Cenomacrops, which was named only a year or two ago from China, and Vesperoterolus, also named from China from 2017, I want to say, had some kind of gripping nature. In the case of Cenomacrops, it's supposedly the first finger in the hand, in other words, what we would call a thumb, is reversed and pointing close to the opposite direction, which you can imagine is very good for gripping a branch. And in the case of Vesperoterilis, it was the feet.
Does that mean Vesperoterilis was hanging like a bat? Because that would be amazing, please. Can you say that's true, please? Oh.
No, we don't have bat pterosaurs. In both cases, I think it's fair to say that it's a bit controversial. No one, to my knowledge, has challenged either of these in the scientific literature. And indeed, in my case, when Vesperoterilis came out, even though it was published in a volume of papers that I edited, I was like, I'm really not convinced of this. But if the author wants to say it, actually, it was my friend Liu Junchang again. I think it was about the last paper he did.
You and him just disagreed on everything. This is
you disagreed with colleagues. This is what happens. I know we talk about him constantly, and he mentioned this. I saw Darren Nash yesterday. We got together physically for the first time in ages, and he said, I listened to your podcast and you keep talking about me. It's like, well, I'm doing it again, so if you're listening, here we go. But we had a lovely day together. We discussed many subjects, several of which we disagree profoundly about, but you can do that with your friends. It's with your enemies that it turns into vicious fights in the literature.
If you need me to beat Darren up, I will.
There you go. There's your warning, mate. In this case, certainly as a referee and an editor, I tend towards if you've got even some vague evidence for it, I tend to let the author publish it and say, let us sort it out. You've seen the specimen and I haven't. I think that's a bit ropey, but I'd rather you got your idea out there and we can discuss it than I kind of blocked it now and it's not really coming out and it might still be right. But anyway, I wasn't very convinced at the time. I went and had a better look at it later when I wrote my big review of Anurognathids last year, or 2020, whichever it was. And I went back to it convinced that I was not going to be convinced by his arguments. And when I read it more carefully and looked at the new photos of the specimen that he'd sent me, I was actually more convinced of it. But that said, I've subsequently had conversations with a couple of colleagues who've gone, nah, it's just a weird way that the specimen's folded. And to be fair, this is something that has actually come up before with birds. It's come up with Archaeopteryx. So we talk about a reversed hallux in birds. So the big toe, so the equivalent of the thumb. So, we talk about in theropods, they walk on three toes and they've got this reduced first toe kind of sticking up, but it still kind of points the same way. And when we get into, modern birds, many, though not all of them, have fully reversed that first toe, and you get them with a...
Pigeons.
Yeah, you get them with one toe pointing backwards. That's actually the thumb or the big toe. It's the first digit and that's now reversed. And so that's a big question of when did that happen? Because it's a perching adaptation. If you want to grip to a branch properly, gripping it front and back is what you want. Chameleons have done it with two, which is why they have these almost perfectly lever-like feet. This is how you grip a branch. And so when and how did birds reverse the hallux? That's pretty much the phrase. And there was an argument that Archaeopteryx had done this and that it was pointing backwards rather unexpectedly. And eventually I think the conclusion came to be that actually no, what it was is that it was a bit loose and a bit flexible and it probably kind of pointed sideways. And then of course once you flatten it, it can go either way. And in some it's just gone backwards because you've flattened something that's out to the side. And the argument that has been made, again, to me in person by a couple of my colleagues, and not yet, and I use the word yet because these, both Vesperoterilis and Cenomacrops are still in the grand scheme of things, very recent publications, last few years, specimens no one else has had a really good look at in person yet, and if they have, they take years to write a paper. The idea is that they're probably coming from the same thing in that they are probably more flexible than normal that you would see in pterosaurs. Otherwise, they wouldn't have ended up this way round, but that they're not truly reversed and have a true grip. And let's say, to be fair, I'm very sympathetic to that point of view because I would say that it's weird that other Anurognathids hadn't done it. If they're capable of evolving this way, you'd think it would kick in pretty early, or once it has kicked in, it would spread rampantly because it would be such a massive adaptation. That's why so many birds have done it repeatedly and in lots of interesting ways, because some have done it with the fourth toe and some have done it with the first and some have done it with both and other things as well. If Anurognathids were doing this a lot, you'd think it would be more effective. And the other question is, quite how effective would it be? Because gripping on a tree trunk is one thing, but actually clambering in branches for a quadruped is really awkward.
Exactly. And it's not, if you think about the way that this was presumably launching itself, it was presumably pressing itself against a tree and launching that way rather than what birds do, which is they need to push down in order to get the height to
Yeah,
flap.
it implies that gripping thin branches is super important for Anurognathids, and that, again, you'd want it in hands and feet, not hands or feet, and then walking along a single branch is actually really difficult. You know, monkeys do it by bringing the arms right round with the elbows going out sideways. Pterosaurs can't really do that.
Maybe you could get that flexible hook and swing. Maybe it could do that.
Yeah, brachiating. So those, you know, again, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the work of my colleagues, but those have been suggested. They obviously have some caveats and may or may not be right. But even if they are, you know, flipped over somewhat artificially, they're still probably representing more than normal flexion in that joint and allowing better gripping. So actually, it's probably still making the same general point, even if the specifics of it, that they have these reverse digits, isn't the case.
Okay, we're running out of time, so very, very, very quickly, any nests?
No, and we just, you know, remember, we haven't got bird nests in the Cretaceous. We're not going to get Anurognathed ones, and we don't. We don't have eggs for them either, because again, if they're that kind of arboreal, they may well be nesting in hollows rather than in the soil like normal pterosaurs would. But yeah, they're just very cool. One last thing to say, actually, so I sort of hinted at this. There's a big question about their taxonomy. Something like 14, 15 specimens of Anurognathids that are decent. Every decent one is near enough complete. As I say, there's a couple of really rogue fragments, but let's not worry about them.
Apart from their delicate, smushy skulls.
Yeah. And then how many species? Almost all of them have been named as separate species. Now, we've talked about this for pterosaurs. We've definitely talked about this for dinosaurs. How confident are we in that? Because it has been an area of contention. And I'll say right now, I know, and if people really know where to hunt on the internet, they'll have seen it. There is a book coming fairly soon, which was one part of it has gone, this Anurognathed taxonomy is rubbish. There's only 2 or 3 species there. Well, that's wrong. And I'll say that quite happily, because we looked at this. I looked at this recently as part of the big review paper that I wrote, having looked at almost every known specimen at the time. And then I've subsequently published a paper with some colleagues led by Yang Jiao last year, where we specifically looked at this when we were doing this growth stuff that I mentioned about their head shape and some other things. And we were basically able to show that, no, quite genuinely, there are unique and distinct characters for almost all of the specimens that we know, and that they really should, if we're being consistent in our pterosaur taxonomy, consider them separate species. And we have taken into account all the growth trajectories of all the different bones and things, and their ratios and their proportions, and well as looking at other distinct traits. And we're really pretty happy with this. And that might still sound artificial to people, but again, remember that bats are extraordinarily diverse. Things like modern nightjars are actually really diverse and almost impossible to tell apart until you catch them and pull their wings apart to look at their feathers. That's basically how you tell nightjars apart.
They do not like that.
We would expect them to be actually in pretty high diversity. And although I've said, you know, loads of these are from these handful of beds in China, they are, but they're still, remember, often a couple of million years apart from each other.
Yeah.
So you would expect there to be more than one species of insect hunter in any given environment, probably half a dozen, potentially if you bats, dozens of them. And for each environment, we've only got 1 or 2 specimens. So it's not a big surprise that although they look very similar, because they're doing similar things, they're separate species. So that artificiality of, oh, it's another Anurognathed and therefore they've named it, isn't what we're doing in this case, very specifically.
I'm also thinking frogs is a very similar example of how the diversity of frogs.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, yes, there are lots of particularly weird frogs with, you know, like rain frogs and the big bullfrogs and stuff. But yeah, you can go along even just in the UK and get your marsh frog and your common frog and a couple of others, or pond frog. What do they look like? They look all the same as each other because they're all frogs.
But they sound slightly different, so they never interbreed.
Yeah. And that's probably what's going on. So yeah, I am fully aware that it looks very bad that another Anurognathed, it's probably a new species. And again, I've already said the North Korean one is probably new. I'm not entirely convinced the 2 Jailoptera specimens are the same thing.
Ooh.
But this is actually exactly what we'd expect. And based on the specimen specimens and the distribution, and we've looked very carefully at this specific issue because it has come up. We are really pretty confident that they are all genuinely distinct, and so this, frankly, horrible, no, you've got it all wrong, smush them all back together, it's not taking into account the actual osteological data and what we predict from their ecology and diversity. So it's wrong.
And on that bombshell.
and on the bombshell of Dave declaring he's right.
That's an unusual thing. But yes, cool. Well, do keep, obviously, sending us your questions. We do an episode at the end of every series, which is a questions episode, so please do send them in. Obviously, we read... What is it?
Well, I was going to suggest, given that we've more or less done a pterosaur series, it'd be nice if the questions were pterosaur-centric. I mean, I'll happily answer other sort of stuff, but let's keep with the theme, because we have answered pterosaur questions before, but we have. I mean, are there any that you've left out? Are you implying that this isn't a complete... No, I'm merely requesting to our wonderful listeners and our even more wonderful patrons who actually give us money, given the theme, it would be nice not to just go, in Jurassic World Dominion, I noticed that.
It won't be Jurassic World Dominion, it will be in the Apple TV.
Again, I'm not making it exclusive. I'm suggesting that pterosaur-focused Q&A would be fun to do, and keep with the theme.
If you have other questions too, though, I can put it to Dave and annoy him. It'll be good. Yeah, dinosaur questions first will be answered by Izzy. That's just as punishment.
Yeah, so there's a reason not to send them in.
It's terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. It is patreon.com/terriblelizards. It's terriblelizards.co.uk. It is at DAVE_HONE, Dave Hone, or at ISZI_LAWRENCE at Izzy Lawrence. You will find us. You must send us your questions and we will answer them. But until then, we've got to give a... should we do a hoot? Because I think they're owl-like.
We're going to do owls, are we? Okay, fine.
Well, why not? Or a croak. It could be a ribbit. You know, it could be... I'd suggest, either a hoot or a ribbit for the Anurognathids.
I think ribbit's more fun.
Okay, look, we'll do froggy frogs then. All right, after 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. To support us, please become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. If you can't do that, don't worry. Just leave us an amazing review on your podcast app. Also, you can check us out on Twitter. I am ISZI_LAWRENCE and Dave is DAVE_HONE. You can also check out our books. Dave's got a load of dinosaur ones. I've got a load of children's ones. I also do other podcasts as well. Go to ISZI.com. If you have dinosaur questions, you're going to want to email terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. That way we can answer them in the questions episode. I think that's all I have time to tell you, but thank you if you support the show already. You are amazing. We will see you next time.